Judge Richard Whitmore thought the woman standing alone at the defense table would become the easiest target he had embarrassed all year. What he did not know was that before the day ended, the entire courtroom would witness a lesson he would never forget. The courthouse in downtown Richmond, Virginia, buzzed with its usual weekday energy. Lawyers hurried through hallways carrying thick folders. Clerks organized stacks of documents behind polished counters. Reporters sat quietly on wooden benches, searching for stories worth telling. Inside Courtroom 4B, sunlight filtered through tall windows and stretched across rows of worn wooden seats. At the front of the room sat Judge Richard Whitmore, a man whose reputation carried almost as much weight as his title. At 58 years old, he was known for his sharp tongue, his impatience, and his habit of reminding everyone that he controlled the room. Some respected him. Others feared him. Many simply avoided attracting his attention. Then Angela Brooks entered the courtroom. Dressed in a simple navy cardigan, modest slacks, and practical shoes, she carried a worn leather folder under one arm. At 42 years old, she looked nothing like the attorneys who normally appeared before the court. There was no expensive suit, no team of assistants, no polished presentation designed to impress. She walked quietly to her place and waited. Several people glanced at her before looking away. To most observers, she appeared to be an ordinary woman handling a legal matter on her own. Judge Whitmore studied her from the bench. His expression immediately hardened. He had already reviewed the schedule and noticed that Angela intended to represent herself. In his experience, self-represented individuals usually struggled with courtroom procedure. They asked the wrong questions. They misunderstood legal terminology. They slowed everything down. The judge leaned back in his chair and sighed loudly enough for others to hear. A few attorneys exchanged knowing looks. The hearing had not even started, yet the atmosphere already felt uncomfortable. Angela remained calm. She placed her folder on the table and quietly reviewed her notes. Her movements were deliberate and unhurried. Across the room, a court reporter adjusted her equipment. A veteran attorney seated in the gallery watched Angela with mild curiosity. There was something unusual about her composure. Most people standing alone before a judge appeared nervous. Angela did not. She seemed completely at ease. The courtroom doors opened briefly as another group entered. On the wall outside, hanging near a display honoring distinguished legal contributors, a framed photograph reflected the morning light. Hundreds of people passed it every week without noticing. Today would be different. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore glanced down at Angela once more and allowed himself a faint smile. He believed he already knew exactly how the next few hours would unfold. The woman standing before him appeared ordinary, unprepared, outmatched. What he could not see was that every assumption he had just made was leading him toward the most shocking moment of his professional career. The hearing began promptly at 9 o'clock. The courtroom clerk called the case, and every eye turned toward Angela Brooks. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses and looked down from the bench with an expression that suggested he had already reached a conclusion. "Ms. Brooks," he said, drawing out the words slightly, "I understand you have chosen to represent yourself today." A faint murmur moved through the gallery. Angela stood calmly. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded slowly. "That is rarely advisable." Several attorneys seated in the audience exchanged quiet smiles. Angela simply acknowledged the comment and waited. Judge Whitmore shuffled a few papers on his desk. "Before we proceed, I trust you understand the rules of evidence, procedural requirements, and applicable standards relevant to this matter." The question sounded less like a request for information and more like an invitation to fail. Angela answered politely, "I do, Your Honor." The judge leaned back. "We shall see." A few people laughed softly. The court reporter continued typing without looking up. Angela remained composed. As the hearing moved forward, Judge Whitmore interrupted her repeatedly. Whenever she began explaining a point, he cut in with another question. Whenever she referenced a document, he demanded additional clarification. The pattern became obvious. Each interruption drew attention to her. Each comment subtly suggested she was unqualified. The atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable. Yet Angela never appeared rattled. She listened carefully and responded with patience. That patience seemed to irritate the judge even more. "Ms. Brooks," he said after another exchange, "perhaps it would be helpful if you limited your remarks to matters you fully understand." The comment produced several chuckles from the back row. Angela looked toward the bench. "I intend to do exactly that, Your Honor." The response was respectful, but something about her tone caused a few observers to glance up from their notes. There was confidence in her voice. Not arrogance. Not defiance. Confidence. Judge Whitmore either failed to notice or chose to ignore it. He continued pressing forward. Every question carried an edge. Every remark seemed designed to remind the room who held authority. Meanwhile, a veteran attorney named Harold Bennett sat quietly near the aisle. At 71 years old, he had spent decades inside courtrooms across Virginia. Experience had taught him to pay attention to details others missed. And something about Angela Brooks was beginning to bother him. Not because she seemed unprepared. Quite the opposite. Her answers were unusually precise. Her terminology was exact. Even the way she organized documents reflected habits developed over many years. Harold narrowed his eyes. Across the room, Angela opened her worn leather folder and calmly located a specific page within seconds. Most self-represented litigants struggled under pressure. She looked completely at home. Outside the courtroom, sunlight continued reflecting off the framed photograph hanging in the hallway. Hundreds of people had passed it that morning. None had stopped to examine it closely. Soon, that would change. Back inside courtroom 4B, Judge Whitmore smiled faintly as he prepared his next question. He believed he was controlling the hearing. He believed the audience was firmly on his side. What he did not realize was that the first cracks in that perception had already begun to appear. Judge Whitmore sensed the attention of the courtroom and seemed determined to keep it focused exactly where he wanted. He glanced toward Angela Brooks and tapped a pen lightly against the bench. "Let us discuss your legal basis for this claim," he said. The tone suggested he was preparing to expose a weakness. Several spectators shifted forward in their seats. A local reporter named Jennifer Hayes stopped reviewing her notes and looked up. Something about the exchange had become increasingly interesting. Angela stood calmly at the defense table. "Certainly, Your Honor." The judge picked up a document and adjusted his glasses. "You are asking this court to consider a fairly specific interpretation of the law. Are you suggesting that multiple previous decisions have been misunderstood?" The question drew immediate attention. It was the kind of challenge that often trapped inexperienced litigants. Angela looked briefly at her notes before answering. "No, Your Honor. I am suggesting that those decisions must be read together with subsequent clarifications and controlling precedent." A few attorneys glanced at one another. Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "Controlling precedent?" His voice carried obvious skepticism. "And which precedent would that be?" The courtroom grew quieter. Angela opened her folder and located a page with remarkable ease. "The appellate ruling issued in Commonwealth versus Hargrove, Your Honor." The judge's expression tightened slightly. It was an accurate citation. He quickly moved on. "Interesting," he said. "And you believe that applies here?" Angela nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The exchange continued. Again and again, Judge Whitmore presented questions designed to create confusion. Again and again, Angela answered without hesitation. She never raised her voice. She never appeared frustrated. She simply responded. The contrast became increasingly noticeable. The more aggressively the judge pushed, the calmer Angela seemed to become. Harold Bennett watched carefully from the gallery. His curiosity had transformed into concern. Not concern for Angela. Concern that something important was being overlooked. Her responses were not merely competent. They were unusually sophisticated. Several times, she referenced procedural principles that many practicing attorneys rarely discussed with such precision. Harold leaned back slowly. The feeling that he should recognize her grew stronger. Across the room, Jennifer Hayes began typing faster. The story she expected that morning had involved a routine hearing. Now she sensed something entirely different unfolding. Judge Whitmore shuffled another set of papers and delivered his most challenging question yet. The inquiry involved multiple legal standards, overlapping jurisdictional issues, and a complicated procedural timeline. A faint smile appeared on his face as he finished speaking. He clearly expected hesitation. He clearly expected failure. Instead, Angela listened patiently. Then she answered point by point. Her explanation was organized, concise, and remarkably clear. Even people with little legal knowledge could follow her reasoning. The courtroom went silent. Not completely silent, but close. The usual rustle of papers faded. The quiet conversation stopped. Even the court reporter briefly looked up before returning to her work. Judge Whitmore stared at Angela for a moment longer than necessary. For the first time that morning, uncertainty flickered across his face. It disappeared quickly, replaced by another question. Yet something had changed. The audience could feel it. The hearing was no longer a demonstration of authority. It was becoming a test of knowledge. And the person many had dismissed only minutes earlier seemed increasingly prepared for every challenge placed before her. Judge Whitmore refused to acknowledge the growing shift in the courtroom. If anything, the unexpected competence Angela Brooks displayed seemed to strengthen his determination. He adjusted the papers on the bench and leaned forward. "Very well, Ms. Brooks," he said. "Since you appear comfortable discussing precedent, perhaps we should explore a more complicated issue." The tone immediately caught the attention of several attorneys seated in the gallery. They recognized it as the voice of a man preparing an ambush. Angela remained standing calmly beside her table. "Of course, Your Honor." The judge began outlining a legal scenario involving overlapping statutory interpretation, appellate review standards, and procedural exceptions that often confused even experienced practitioners. As he spoke, several spectators exchanged glances. The question was unusually complex for the matter before the court. Jennifer Hayes stopped typing for a moment and looked up. Harold Bennett folded his hands together and listened carefully. Everyone sensed that Judge Whitmore had chosen this challenge for a reason. When he finally finished, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. The courtroom became very quiet. Angela listened without interruption. She did not immediately answer. Instead, she opened her folder and reviewed a single page. The pause seemed to encourage the judge. Several people assumed she had finally reached a question she could not answer. Then Angela looked up. "The difficulty with that interpretation, Your Honor, is that it conflicts with the framework established by later appellate guidance." The smile on the judge's face faded slightly. Angela continued. Her explanation unfolded step by step, each point building naturally on the one before it. She cited statutory language. She referenced procedural principles. She connected decisions issued years apart and explained how they work together. What made her response remarkable was not merely its accuracy. It was its clarity. Even people with limited legal knowledge could follow her reasoning. A hush fell across the courtroom. Judge Whitmore attempted to interrupt twice, but Angela respectfully paused each time and then completed her explanation. By the time she finished, several attorneys were openly staring. Harold Bennett slowly sat back in his chair. The feeling of familiarity had become impossible to ignore. He had spent decades watching lawyers argue before judges. Very few possessed this level of command. Fewer still could explain complicated legal concepts so effortlessly. Across the room, Jennifer Hayes resumed typing rapidly. She knew a story was developing. The judge cleared his throat. "That is an interesting theory," he said. The words sounded less confident than before. Angela shook her head gently. "It is not a theory, Your Honor. It is the controlling interpretation." The courtroom went silent. Completely silent. Even the clerk stopped moving papers for a moment. Judge Whitmore stared down at Angela. The authority he had relied upon all morning remained intact, but the certainty behind it was beginning to crack. For the first time since the hearing started, he looked less like a man conducting a lesson and more like a man facing an unexpected challenge. Outside the courtroom, the framed photograph in the hallway remained untouched on the wall. Yet within the next hour, that forgotten image would answer a question nobody had thought to ask. And when that answer finally arrived, every assumption in Courtroom 4B would change. The tension inside Courtroom 4B had changed so gradually that many people could not identify the exact moment it happened. Yet everyone could feel it. Earlier that morning, the attention in the room had revolved around Judge Whitmore. Now, more and more eyes were focused on Angela Brooks. The judge shuffled through another stack of documents and attempted to regain control of the hearing. "Let us assume for a moment that your interpretation is correct," he said. "How would you reconcile it with the procedural limitations established under the revised framework?" Several attorneys immediately recognized the question. It was not impossible to answer, but it was notoriously difficult. The issue had generated debate for years. Judge Whitmore clearly expected the complexity to create hesitation. Angela reviewed a page in her folder and then looked up. The revised framework must be read in conjunction with the appellate clarification issued 3 years later, Your Honor. Her answer came without delay. The judge frowned slightly. Angela continued. She cited the exact section. Then she explained how later rulings had narrowed the application of the earlier standard. She spoke calmly, never rushing, never raising her voice. The explanation was so precise that several attorneys instinctively began taking notes. Harold Bennett stared at her in disbelief. Most lawyers spent years developing that level of command. Yet Angela delivered it as naturally as someone discussing directions to a familiar street. Across the room, Jennifer Hayes noticed something else. Judge Whitmore had stopped interrupting. Earlier, he had challenged nearly every sentence Angela spoke. Now he seemed to be listening more carefully. The change was subtle but impossible to ignore. The judge cleared his throat and asked another question. Angela answered. He asked a follow-up. Angela answered again. One by one, the challenges that had seemed designed to expose weakness instead highlighted her expertise. A hush fell across the courtroom. Even people with no legal background could sense what was happening. The dynamic had shifted. Judge Whitmore was no longer leading Angela toward a mistake. He was searching for one, and he was not finding it. Harold Bennett slowly rose from his seat. The movement attracted a few curious glances. He stepped quietly into the hallway outside the courtroom. His thoughts kept returning to the same memory. Years ago, he had attended a legal symposium featuring one of the brightest constitutional scholars he had ever encountered. A young woman whose analysis had impressed judges, professors, and senior attorneys alike. Harold walked toward the framed photographs displayed along the corridor. Sunlight streamed through the windows as he examined them one by one. Then he stopped. His eyes widened. There, near the center of a display honoring distinguished legal contributors, was a photograph taken nearly 15 years earlier. A younger Angela Brooks stood among a group of nationally recognized legal scholars. Harold stared at the image for several seconds. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore prepared yet another difficult question. He still believed he could regain the advantage. What he did not know was that only a few feet away, the first piece of a forgotten story had just been rediscovered. And once that story entered the courtroom, nothing would ever feel the same again. When Harold Bennett re-entered Courtroom 4B, he carried something far more significant than a memory. His expression had changed completely. The veteran attorney moved quietly back to his seat, but his eyes never left Angela Brooks. The photograph he had just seen in the hallway had answered a question that had been troubling him all morning. Across the courtroom, Judge Whitmore remained focused on the hearing. He continued reviewing documents, searching for weaknesses, searching for inconsistencies, searching for the mistake he was convinced would eventually appear. Angela stood calmly at her table, her worn leather folder still open before her. Nothing about her posture suggested concern. Nothing about her demeanor suggested uncertainty. The judge cleared his throat and presented another legal challenge. This one involved a rarely discussed appellate standard that many attorneys encountered only a handful of times during their careers. Several people in the gallery exchanged glances. It was an unusually technical issue. Jennifer Hayes immediately recognized what was happening. The judge was raising the level of difficulty again. Angela listened carefully. Then she answered. Not only did she address the question directly, but she referenced a little-known appellate opinion that clarified the exact issue under discussion. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. One attorney near the back slowly lowered his pen. Another looked up from his notes. A third began flipping through a legal reference book. Judge Whitmore frowned. You seem unusually familiar with that decision, Ms. Brooks. Angela nodded politely. I am familiar with it, Your Honor. The answer was simple, yet something about it lingered in the room. Harold Bennett could no longer remain silent. He slowly rose from his seat. The movement attracted attention immediately. Judge Whitmore looked toward him. Mr. Bennett, is there something you wish to add? Harold hesitated for a moment. Perhaps not to the legal argument, Your Honor. His eyes shifted toward Angela. But there may be something relevant to the court's understanding of who is presenting it. The room grew still. Jennifer Hayes stopped typing. Several spectators leaned forward. Judge Whitmore looked annoyed by the interruption. And what exactly does that mean? Harold glanced toward Angela again. I believe I know who Ms. Brooks is. For the first time all morning, a flicker of surprise crossed Angela's face. It disappeared almost immediately. The judge folded his arms. Please explain. Harold took a slow breath. Years ago, one of the most respected constitutional scholars in the country presented at a symposium I attended. Her work was cited by judges, professors, and appellate attorneys across multiple states. The courtroom remained silent. Her analysis became required reading in several legal programs. A few attorneys exchanged puzzled looks. Harold continued. That scholar was Angela Brooks. A hush fell across the courtroom. Complete silence. Even the faint sounds of movement stopped. Jennifer Hayes stared at Angela in disbelief. Several attorneys looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. Judge Whitmore's expression froze. The confidence that had carried him through the morning suddenly seemed much less certain. And as the realization began spreading through the room, the hearing stopped feeling like an ordinary court proceeding. It felt like the beginning of a revelation. The silence that followed Harold Bennett's statement seemed to stretch across the entire courtroom. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the faint hum of the ventilation system overhead. Jennifer Hayes looked from Harold to Angela and then back again, as if trying to confirm she had heard correctly. Several attorneys immediately reached for their phones. Others searched their memories. The name Angela Brooks was beginning to unlock old recollections throughout the room. Judge Whitmore remained still behind the bench. His expression revealed almost nothing, but the confidence that had defined his demeanor all morning was noticeably fading. Harold took a slow breath and continued. Years ago, legal journals across the country published her work. Judges cited her analysis. Universities invited her to speak. She was considered one of the brightest constitutional minds of her generation. The words landed heavily. A murmur spread through the gallery. Angela lowered her eyes briefly before looking back toward the bench. She appeared neither proud nor embarrassed. She simply appeared resigned to the fact that a chapter of her past was no longer hidden. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. If that is true, he said carefully, why would someone with those credentials be standing here representing herself? It was a reasonable question, and everyone in the courtroom seemed eager to hear the answer. Angela folded her hands calmly. Because expertise does not exempt anyone from ordinary life, Your Honor. The room fell silent again. She continued, I stepped away from public work many years ago. I chose a different path. That does not mean I forgot what I learned. Several people exchanged thoughtful glances. Jennifer typed every word. Harold nodded quietly. The answer somehow carried more weight than a lengthy explanation ever could. Judge Whitmore looked down at the documents before him. For the first time all morning, he seemed unsure of how to proceed. The hearing he expected had vanished completely. Angela was no longer the inexperienced participant he believed he could intimidate. She was someone whose understanding of the law rivaled, and perhaps exceeded, that of many professionals in the room. Determined to regain control, the judge asked another legal question. It involved a constitutional issue rarely discussed outside advanced legal circles. A few attorneys visibly reacted. This was no longer ordinary courtroom debate. Angela listened attentively and then responded with remarkable precision. She cited foundational principles, connected them to modern appellate interpretations, and explained their practical application in language so clear that even spectators without legal training could follow her reasoning. A hush fell across the courtroom. One attorney slowly removed his glasses and stared at her. Another shook his head in disbelief. Even the court clerk appeared captivated. Judge Whitmore attempted a follow-up challenge. Angela answered. He raised another point. She answered again. Each exchange strengthened the same conclusion. The woman he had spent hours dismissing possessed an extraordinary command of the law. The atmosphere had completely transformed. Earlier, people watched expecting humiliation. Now they watched history unfold. And as realization spread through Courtroom 4B, many began to understand something far more important than Angela's credentials. True brilliance rarely announces itself. Sometimes it walks into a room dressed simply, speaks softly, and waits for others to reveal their assumptions first. By early afternoon, the atmosphere inside Courtroom 4B no longer resembled the hearing that had begun that morning. The balance of the room had shifted completely. Every attorney, reporter, clerk, and spectator seemed focused on Angela Brooks. The woman many had quietly dismissed hours earlier now stood at the center of a revelation nobody had expected. Jennifer Hayes continued typing rapidly, determined not to miss a single detail. Harold Bennett sat quietly with his hands folded, watching events unfold with the satisfaction of someone who had finally solved a mystery. Behind the bench, Judge Whitmore reviewed his notes once again. The confidence that had fueled his earlier remarks had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Yet he was unwilling to surrender control of the proceeding. "Ms. Brooks," he said carefully, "you have demonstrated considerable knowledge. However, knowledge alone does not determine the outcome of a legal matter." Angela nodded respectfully. "I agree, Your Honor." The answer caught him slightly off guard. There was no challenge in her voice, no attempt to embarrass him, only calm agreement. The judge continued, "Then perhaps you can explain how your position satisfies both the statutory requirements and the constitutional concerns raised by the opposing interpretation." Several attorneys looked up immediately. It was another difficult question, yet this time the challenge felt different. It no longer sounded like an attempt to expose ignorance. It sounded like a genuine test. Angela opened her folder and calmly began her response. She connected statutes, constitutional principles, and appellate decisions with remarkable clarity. Every point supported the next. Every citation fit naturally into the larger framework. As she spoke, people throughout the courtroom began recognizing just how extraordinary her understanding truly was. A hush fell across the room. Even those unfamiliar with legal procedure could sense they were witnessing something unusual. Angela was not merely answering questions. She was teaching. The court reporter slowed briefly, almost mesmerized by the precision of her explanations. Jennifer Hayes glanced around the room and noticed something she would later include in her article. Nobody was looking at Judge Whitmore anymore. They were looking at Angela. The realization seemed to reach the judge as well. He paused longer than usual before speaking again. Then he looked directly at Angela. "Your analysis is exceptionally thorough." The courtroom became silent. Those words carried enormous weight coming from a man who had spent most of the day questioning her competence. Angela simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." The exchange lasted only seconds, but everyone felt its significance. Judge Whitmore glanced toward the gallery and noticed the expressions around him. Attorneys who had once smirked now looked impressed. Spectators who had expected humiliation now looked inspired. Reporters who arrived searching for routine court coverage had discovered a far more powerful story. For the first time all day, the judge appeared to understand the full scope of his mistake. He had mistaken simplicity for weakness. He had mistaken humility for ignorance. And now the entire courtroom could see it. The room remained quiet as sunlight streamed through the tall windows. No one laughed. No one whispered. No one moved. In that moment, the authority of a title seemed far less important than the authority of wisdom. And Judge Whitmore finally realized that the woman standing before him had possessed that wisdom all along. The final moments of the hearing unfolded very differently from how anyone in Courtroom 4B had expected. The tension that had dominated the morning was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. Judge Whitmore reviewed the last of the documents before him and remained silent for several seconds. No one interrupted. No one shifted in their seat. The courtroom seemed to understand that something important was happening. Angela Brooks stood calmly at her table, exactly as she had throughout the entire day. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued for attention. She had not attempted to embarrass anyone. She had simply allowed her knowledge, preparation, and professionalism to speak for themselves. Finally, Judge Whitmore looked up. His expression no longer carried the impatience or confidence that had defined the beginning of the hearing. Instead, there was something much rarer: humility. He carefully summarized the legal issues before the court and acknowledged several of the arguments Angela had presented. More than once, he referenced points that only hours earlier he had seemed eager to dismiss. As he spoke, the attorneys in the gallery listened closely. Jennifer Hayes continued typing, knowing she was witnessing a remarkable conclusion. When the judge finished his review, he delivered his ruling. The decision reflected the legal reasoning Angela had defended throughout the hearing. A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom, not because people were surprised by the outcome anymore, but because they understood what it represented. The law had prevailed. Facts had prevailed. Competence had prevailed. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses and looked directly at Angela. For a moment, the room became completely silent. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "the court appreciates the thoroughness and professionalism you demonstrated today." No one missed the significance of those words. Earlier that morning, he had questioned whether she even understood the process. Now he was publicly recognizing her expertise. Angela nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge hesitated briefly before continuing. It would appear that several assumptions were made today that should not have been made. The statement was simple, but everyone understood its meaning. A hush fell across the courtroom. Angela could have responded with triumph. She could have reminded everyone how she had been treated. She could have pointed out every dismissive comment and every unfair assumption. Instead, she simply smiled. The law works best when we focus on facts rather than appearances, Your Honor. The room went silent once again. Even Jennifer stopped typing for a second. The words carried a quiet power that no dramatic speech could match. Judge Whitmore lowered his eyes and gave a small nod. It was the closest thing to an apology many people had ever seen from him. As the hearing concluded, attorneys approached Angela to introduce themselves. Reporters requested interviews. Spectators offered words of admiration. She thanked them politely but declined the attention. Gathering her worn leather folder, she walked toward the exit with the same quiet dignity she had carried into the courthouse that morning. As she passed through the hallway, sunlight reflected once more off the framed photograph that had helped reveal her past. This time, people stopped to look at it. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer than usual, lost in thought. And that day, everyone who witnessed the hearing remembered a lesson far more important than any legal argument. True brilliance does not need to announce itself. It only needs the opportunity to be seen.